morning. This is Heather Van Wild with a special edition of Raindrop Works. Um, this is a first attempt with some new tech and gear that I have, and trying to see about doing some stuff from home as I look through different court cases. I've heard some people suggest that they wouldn't mind seeing this kind of work, so I'll give it a shot. There was a filing that just came out, looks like over the, probably on Friday. It was filed on the 27th. Oh, no, wait, if it was filed on the 27th, then yeah, that was Friday. I forgot it's already the 1st right now, so my calendar was off. This is from, Judge Hernandez, who is handling the Don't Shoot PDX case. Basically, this particular case is one of the first ones that was started in the wake of the Portland protests against the George Floyd murder and the subsequent racial justice movement that has blossomed here. There has been an opinion and order that has come out, which when I first saw it, I thought could have been related to the case as a whole. I read through about half of it before realizing no, it's not, which would have been very surprising if it was. But there is some very significant stuff that appears to be coming from this, so I figured I would go back and just read everything from scratch, but this time with other people here to be able to see it. So, with that being said, here is the order itself. United States District Court for the District of Oregon. It's Don't Shoot Portland with Roberts, Belden, Johnson, and other similarly situated plaintiffs. This is basically a class action case where everyone that has been involved in the protests could potentially be affected by this. This particular order is in regards to the City of Portland and Multnomah County. This particular lawsuit has had the federal government brought in through the U.S. Marshal Service and DHS and other organizations, but this particular motion is only dealing with local law enforcement. Okay. So, as Judge Hernandez said, plaintiffs Don't Shoot Portland, Nicholas Roberts, Michelle Misha Belden, and Alexandra Johnson, on behalf of themselves and all other similarly situated, bring this case against defendants of Portland and Multnomah County. The plaintiffs allege that defendants have violated their First and Fourth Amendments in the use of less lethal force during recent and ongoing Portland protests. On June 9th, the court issued a temporary restraining order barring the use of tear gas by defendant City of Portland except in situations in which the lives or safety of the public or police were at risk. It was a very weak restriction on tear gas usage because the city basically just turned around and every time things started acting up, they would say, okay, it's unlawful, we have to use tear gas to protect ourselves, until Mayor Wheeler came out and said, no, we're not going to use tear gas at all. It was kind of a cop-out by all accounts, but it is what happened. Okay, so based on the stipulation of the party, the court further restrained defendants' City of Portland's use of less lethal munitions on June 26th. At this point now, the plaintiffs moved for a finding of contempt and remedial sanctions against the city, alleging violations of the June 26th restraining order by police officers on the evening of June 30th. This was a night where, and some of the specifics will be gone into with as we're reading this, but the police made a very strong showing at the Portland Police Association building, the Union building. A number of reporters were arrested, including Corey Ellis. He was arrested after basically naming a particular officer that he recognized from past reporting work that he's done. Eric Greatwood, Veterans for Truth, he actually got shot by riot cops in this. And they'll be going on with some of these things. But this was a night where the cops showed up very hot and heavy, were unusually, for the time, aggressive and abusive towards protesters, and ended up doing a lot of damage. I believe that was one of the nights where the entire Lombard neighborhood got tear gassed. And there was, because we had just had this new restraining order that had been restricting what the cops could do to help preserve the rights of protesters, and they still violated it, the plaintiffs came forward and said, this is not right. The city is blatantly disregarding the order that the judge has said you must do this, and we want to make sure that they're unable to do that again. And that's what this is going to be. So, they said, at the evidentiary hearing on October 21st and 22nd, plaintiffs emphasized 9 specific instances in which they argued officers used less lethal munitions in violation of the restraining order. Because plaintiffs have shown by clear and convincing evidence that the defendant violated the order 3 times on June 30th, the court grants in part plaintiffs' amended motion for order to show cause and finds defendant in contempt. In part means there are some arguments that the judge agreed with, some that may not have either applied in the situation or may not have had enough evidence to support. But getting any of this is still important. So, as I said for background, in the wake of the May 2020 killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, individuals in Portland have taken to the streets to protest police brutality and racial inequality. These protests have ranged from peaceful gatherings and marches to violent clashes between protesters and the police. On the evening of June 30th, 2020, 200 to 250 protesters gathered at Peninsula Park in northeast Portland. The Peninsula Park gathering was peaceful and did not require any police intervention. Following the gathering, some of the protesters marched to the Portland Police Association building, where they were met by a line of Oregon State police officers. From this point, things escalated quickly. That evening, like many others before it, the Portland Police Bureau deployed its rapid response team. The RRT is an all-hazards team within Portland Police. One of its primary responsibilities is to assist with crowd management and crowd control. The RRT is divided into 4 squads of 12 to 15 officers, including a few grenadiers. RRT grenadiers carry 2 types of less lethal impact munitions: FN 303s with a marking or PAVA rounds, which are pepper spray, and 40mm less lethal launchers with marking rounds. For those of us who are intimately familiar with Brett Taylor, he is one of the RRT's grenadiers, and he does come up frequently in the testimony that was given in this case. Okay. Now, according to Portland Police Officer Zachary Domka, a lead grenadier trainer who was present on the evening of June 30th, grenadiers undergo 30 hours of initial training and refresher trainings twice a year. Because of the COVID pandemic, however, no refresher trainings have been held for RRT grenadiers since the fall of 2019. Portland Police also assigns a crowd management incident commander to assist in responding to large planned protest events. These are the people who make the decision that a protest is an unlawful gathering or a riot, and they communicate when the LRAD or loudspeaker system or whatever is supposed to give instructions. Captain Passadori was the crowd management incident commander on June 30th. As the incident commander, he was responsible for, among other things, gathering information, setting priorities for the event, providing all assisting organizations with an operational briefing, and coordinating that evening's crowd control activities from the incident command center. Now, of course, we've had several instances now where Portland Police have come out and said, please contact our liaison officer so that we can coordinate to safely do these protests. And because most of the protests that they're talking about are leaderless or people who don't want to be supporting or working with the cops, they don't get a response from that. I will say that my attempts as press to contact the police to get statements and information and stuff have not gone very well either. So that's it. Because the order was new to him on June 30th, Captain Passador testified that he took steps to ensure that all officers were familiar with the order that had come out on June 26th. Captain Passador directed all supervisors to make sure that all supervisors informed each individual officer of the requirements of both temporary restraining orders, the one from the beginning of June and the one from the few days before. Later, after calling for attention over the radio, he read a statement conveying the contents of the order that was transmitted to all officers and supervisors assigned to the event. So they had been refreshed that night on what the limitations were in regards to the restraining order. The Craddock Peninsula Park remained calm and did not require any police intervention. However, early intelligence reports suggest that protesters were going to march to Portland Police Bureau's North Precinct. This concerned Captain Passadori because protesters had previously set fire to police buildings in Portland. Accordingly, Captain Passadori preemptively sent officers and other resources to the North Precinct. But the Craddock Peninsula Park redirected its march to the PPA building, which houses the Public Service Union for Portland police officers. In the hope that police presence would deter protesters from gathering outside the PPA, Captain Passadori instructed OSP units assisting Portland police that night to maintain a presence there. So basically, before the protesters even arrived at where they wanted to protest, it sounds like they were trying to somewhat restrict the freedom of assembly by saying, no, we want to keep you away from where you're going. We've had much worse instances where police have since tried to say, no, you can't even leave the park. But that's been months after. So, at the PPA. After protesters arrived at the PPA around 9 p.m., the event quickly devolved into chaos. Upon arrival, protesters encountered a line of OSP officers dressed in riot gear holding batons and other less lethal munitions. Video of the protest shows a group of individuals standing outside the PPA chanting and dancing. Water bottles thrown from the crowd of protesters can be seen landing near officers' feet. I would say by them landing near the officers' feet, yes, there could be some quote-unquote danger, but it's a very small risk. I mean, they've got riot gear. These are water bottles that aren't even quite making it to people. If somebody was throwing that at me, I'd take a half step back, and that would be all I'd need. Anyway, radio communications from officers on the street described items being thrown at officers within a minute of the protesters' arrival, including bottles and rocks. Captain Passadori recalls a change in the tone of the officers' voices as the situation began to escalate. Because these projectiles, Captain Passadori declared the protest an unlawful activity only a few minutes after protesters arrived at the PPA building. In doing so, he authorized police to move and disperse the crowd to the east. Using the long-range acoustical device, the LRAD, PPB announced that the event had been declared an unlawful assembly and instructed protesters to move east. At some point, Portland Police RRT officers joined OSP officers at the PPA building. A video from a bystander shows police with batons and other munitions standing shoulder to shoulder in a line, moving protesters east down Lombard Street and away from the PPA. In pushing the crowd of protesters away from the PPA building, officers used physical force and deployed less lethal munitions. In videos of the protest, officers can be seen shoving protesters with their hands and batons. One witness testified that officers indiscriminately fired munitions into the crowd as it was moved backwards, striking more than 10 individuals. These Pavel rounds from the FN-303s are not supposed to be used indiscriminately. They're fired like, say, paintball bullets. You aim them at someone and you point, and you're not supposed to, by police policy, use them against people that are not being aggressive towards you. So they're supposed to choose their targets and only use them as needed. Okay, so first incident, Andrew Klingman. During the push east, officers deployed OC gas spray against protester Andrew Klingman. Mr. Klingman, a software engineer, was near the police line. Now, when they say OC spray, it sounds like this was a canned pepper spray that they, just... As he was moving backward with the crowd, he noticed an officer without any visible identifying information on his uniform. This has been an ongoing issue the entire time we've had these protests. Police were given permission to obscure their masks or their names and badge numbers, and there's been a nightmare of a time matching the ID numbers that they were supplied with to the actual police, including a number of times where they aren't showing any identification and won't provide anything. Which means, how are we supposed to hold a particular officer accountable if there are 20 officers that we can't identify because they're all anonymously covered up with no markings? So at that point, he pointed at the officer and asked for his identifying number. The officer did not respond, but a different officer stepped forward in the line and pushed Mr. Klingman with a baton. When the officer pushed him a second time using a downward motion, Mr. Klingman felt like he was losing his footing and, without thinking, grabbed the officer's baton to stop himself from falling. He testified that as soon as he realized what he had done, he let go. But seconds later, after Mr. Klingman was pushed away by another officer, another PPB officer sprayed him in the face with OC spray as he turned his head back towards the police line. So it looked like he was falling back, started to turn around to look, and got sprayed for it. Incidents 2 and 3. Unknown individuals carrying a banner. Around the same time, Portland police officer and RRT Grenadier Brent Taylor deployed 15 rounds from his FN 303 in 2 incidences involving a struggle over a banner. According to officers Domka and Taylor, signs and banners at protests can present a security threat to officers. Officer Taylor testified that in his experience, banners and signs can be draped across plywood shields reinforced with nails and PVC pipes containing screws or concrete, which could be used as weapons to impale an officer. I will just say that to date I have not heard of any of these tactics being used in protests over the summer and into the fall here. Now, when a particular sign is assessed, whether a particular sign is assessed as a threat depends on the overall crowd dynamic, the behavior of the individuals holding the sign, and the materials from which the sign is constructed. That night, a group of protesters carrying a large banner with a PVC pipe frame. Video shows the protesters carrying the banner moving slowly backwards with the rest of the crowd in compliance with the Portland Police's commands to move east. Officer Taylor testified that as police moved the crowd, he observed other protesters trying to get behind the banner, suggesting that it might be used as a shield. From what I've seen of video, I do think they were trying to use it as a shield, but not as defensive, more of just covering themselves up because they're being shot at and sprayed at, and it was a very large Black Lives Matter sign. Now, in addition, he's observed that some individuals that evening were dressed in all black, wore helmets and respirators, and had engaged in skirmishes with officers along the police line. At that point, being dressed in black and having helmets and respirators was a standard thing. I still have a helmet and a respirator for when I've been out documenting these protests, because we know police have used these kinds of weapons indiscriminately, and it's a safety hazard. So, according to officers Domka and Taylor, the protesters carrying the banner were also slowing police efforts to move the crowd and interfering with the police formation. Basically, they weren't moving as fast as the cops wanted them to. Because of these circumstances, Officer Taylor attempted to take the banner from the protesters. A protester on the opposite side of the banner from Officer Taylor refused to let go of the banner even after another officer hit the protester's wrist with a baton. Officer Taylor testified at this moment that he suspected the protester was trying to retain the banner to use as a weapon. And accordingly, he deployed 5 rounds of his FN 303 at the protesters' legs, causing them to release the banner and move back towards the crowd. I will say that, from my understanding, I think that is actually the proper way to use an FN 303, by shooting. It's either shooting at center mass or shooting at the legs, but I think the legs are generally preferred, even though there is risk of circulation damage. Anyway, officers continued to pull the banner away from the remaining protesters who were still holding on. One such protester was an individual on roller skates wearing a backpack. At some point in the struggle over the banner, the individual fell to the ground, and officers appeared to grab and shove the individual and pull them away from the sign. Officer Taylor believed that the officers were attempting to take the individual on roller skates into custody because officers had their hands on the individual and were pulling them towards the police line. He also believed two other protesters were simultaneously attempting to unarrest or stop the arrest of the individual because they were pulling the individual back into the crowd. According to Officer Taylor, unarrests are dangerous for both the individual being arrested and the officers involved in the arrest. To overcome the resistance of the protesters, officers may resort to higher levels of force against the arrestee, and officers may be harmed by the protesters seeking to effectuate the unarrest. Thus, to prevent an assault or the use of a higher level of force by the arresting officers, Officer Taylor deployed 10 rounds from his FN-303 against the legs of the protesters before the protesters succeeded in pulling the individual on roller skates into the crowd. So, Incident 4, an unknown individual throwing a bottle. After moving the protesters a block or so to the east, the crowd stopped moving, but individuals in the crowd continued to throw items at police officers. For example, one individual attempted to throw a bottle at the police line, prompting officers to respond by deploying a few rounds from an FN-303. In an attempt to de-escalate the situation and reset, Captain Pastore ordered his RRT units to return to the PPA building. To pull safely back, officers rolled smoke canisters toward the protest line to create a wall of smoke between officers and protesters. Rather than allow the officers to retreat, the deployment of smoke canisters led to use of additional, less lethal munitions by the police. Basically, they're saying that the cops threw out smoke canisters and then shot into them, where they may have had difficulty seeing who they were shooting, and also that wasn't the reason why they were supposed to deploy the gas. It was supposed to be so they could fall back. So, anyway, Pedro Anglada Cordero, a social worker attending the protest because of the history of white supremacy in Oregon and his own experiences with racism while living in Portland, spontaneously kicked a smoke canister away from himself and his wife when one was tossed in his direction. He testified that he did so to keep himself, his wife, and others safe from exposure to smoke and chemical agents. But in doing so, Mr. Anglada kicked the canister twice in the direction of the police line. Officers responded by firing two 40mm less lethal rounds at Mr. Anglada, striking him behind the knee and on his inner right thigh. Additional munitions were fired as he was retreating. According to Officers Domka and Taylor, the act of kicking or throwing a smoke canister at the police amounts to a threat or act of assault. Now remember, them using them on you is just part of their job. You trying to get them out of the way is an assault. But when thrown, smoke canisters become dangerous projectiles due to their weight and temperature. And I do have a smoke canister that did not go off properly, and it is pretty beefy. As far as temperature, we have seen that some of them can get to the point where they are glowing hot, which I believe for aluminum is about 800 degrees Celsius. So they do get very hot, and they are pretty heavy, and they put out a lot of noxious materials. So when kicked, the smoke encompasses officers instead of the protesters, limiting officers' visibility. Instead of limiting protesters' visibility like the cops want. Officer Taylor testified that in his experience, kicking canisters back at police can be part of a coordinated attack on the part of some protesters. By enveloping officers in smoke from their own munitions, protesters have a clear line of sight to throw projectiles at police officers. The officers ultimately retreated to the PPA building, and the crowd followed, stopping less than a block away. After police pulled back, protesters moved recycling bins, trash cans, and dumpsters into the street, one of which was set on fire. Eventually, an individual lit an item on fire from one of the garbage bins and walked it to one of the unlit dumpsters. In response, police fired a 40mm marking round at the individual. Officer Domka testified that the spread of the fire could create a more hazardous condition for officers. The smoke and heat distortion from fire makes it harder to see projectiles, and it was likely that officers would need to move their police line among the burning dumpsters and garbage cans because the crowd was not dispersing. Eventually, police officers moved past the dumpsters and pushed protesters further east. Protesters continued to throw rocks, bottles, full cans of beer, and smoke bombs at the police line. Some protesters shined green lasers in the officers' eyes. After the sun had set, officers once again deployed smoke canisters, and protesters kicked the canisters back at the police. Katrina Haas, who was protesting police brutality and documenting the protests for other individuals who could not attend due to their disabilities, moved to kick a smoke munition away from after one landed near her feet. She testified that she wanted to distance herself from the munition in order to prevent injury. In response, officers deployed an impact munition that injured her leg, causing her to leave the crowd and hang back on the sidewalk for the rest of the evening. Incident number 8, Eric Greatwood, who at the time was a frequent streamer on the ground at these events. Around the same time, Eric Greatwood, an Air Force veteran who had live-streamed numerous protests that month, saw an inert smoke canister roll near his position toward the front of the crowd. Be surprised how many of these don't even go off properly. Mr. Greatwood testified that he wanted to inspect the canister. Because he was managing bulky camera equipment, which he at the time was using about a 20-foot tall pole that had a GoPro mounted on top of it, his movements were slow. He testified he took a few steps forward to pick it up, slowly lunging to grab the munition. Mr. Greatwood testified he was hit in the groin with the munition before ever making contact with it. He also testified that another protester picked up the munition. However, video of the incident shows Mr. Greatwood walking quickly toward the smoke canister and successfully picking it up. I would, possibly say that getting shot in the nuts makes you forget things. Officer Taylor testified he engaged Mr. Greatwood with an FN 303 as he was picking up the munition because he was concerned that he would throw it back at the police line. And the 9th incident. About an hour after protesters arrived, officers and protesters came to a standstill a couple blocks from the PPA building, with some distance between the police and the crowd. An individual walked out of the crowd in front of the line of protesters, approaching an unknown object in the street. As the individual reached for the object, police fired impact munitions at the individual and they quickly retreated into the crowd. Officer Domke testified that the use of force in this moment was appropriate because the individual, by stepping out in front of the protest and reaching towards an object on the pavement, may have indicated that they were about to throw the object back at officers. In the minutes that followed, protesters continued to throw dangerous projectiles at the police line with increasing frequency and velocity. Some officers were hit and required medical attention. At around 10:10 that evening, Captain Passadori declared the event a riot due to the number of projectiles thrown and the danger that they posed to police and protesters. Portland police deployed CS gas to disperse the crowd, and protesters were pushed further east into a more commercial neighborhood just east of Interstate 5. Hours later, the protest ended. Then we talk about the standards of how the court handles these things. They have the inherent power to enforce compliance with its orders, the authority to punish contempt defined by federal statute, basically they can punish by fine or imprisonment or both if there's misbehavior of any person in its presence or so near as the obstruction of administration of justice, misbehavior of any of its officers in their official transactions, or disobedience, resistance to its lawful writ, process, order, rule, decree, or command. And this is a case of disobedience of a court order. Okay. So Section 401 contains no limitation on the power of the district court to impose fine or imprisonment for a violation. The trial court's decision is reviewed for an abuse of discretion in setting punishment. Basically, the court can do what they want as far as setting a fine or imprisonment for a violation of this, but it can be reviewed later to see if it was excessive. So whether a contempt is civil or criminal depends on the character or purpose of the punishment. The question is, what does the court primarily seek to accomplish by imposing the sanction? You want to make it something that will prevent continued failure. If you say, I'm going to charge you $20 for violating this court order, but the person's a millionaire, they're not going to care. They'll be like, okay, that's worth it. Okay. So criminal contempt is intended to punish past defiance of the court's authority and vindicate the court. Civil contempt is designed to compel obedience or compensate the contemptor's adversary for their injuries. Contempt is plainly civil in nature when the sanction imposed is wholly remedial, serves only the purpose of the complainant, and is not intended as a deterrent to offenses against the public. While events this year have brought thousands of Portlanders to the streets demanding change. While many of these protests are peaceful, many also devolve into chaos, especially those that stretch late into the night. Individuals and crowds of otherwise peaceful protesters and activists have lit fires and launched bottles, cans, rocks, and fireworks from great distance at police officers. Officers have responded with significant force in wielding batons against protesters and deploying scores of less lethal munitions, including CS gas. Both sides have caused significant injuries. The evening of June 30th was no exception. The evidence put forth by plaintiffs and defendant document hours of violence, including threats to the safety of police and protesters alike. But despite its efforts to live up to the standards of the order and exercise restraint in the face of such turmoil, Portland police failed. In their use of impact munitions on June 30th, officers violated the court's June 26th order governing defendants' use of less lethal force. And then they do give a little bit more detail here. In their briefing, plaintiffs discussed at length the use of other types of force, including physical force, batons, smoke, and CS gas. However, these are not covered by the court's June 26th order, and plaintiffs have not argued that the use of CS gas that evening violated the court's June 9th order. Thus, at this point in the litigation, the court offers no opinion as to the propriety of defendants' use of physical force, baton, smoke, and CS gas on the evening of June 30th. So we'll see what that means later on. It said civil contempt consists of a party's disobedience to a specific and definite court order by failure to take all reasonable steps within the party's power to comply. The contempt need not be willful, but a person should not be held in contempt if his action appeared to be based on a good faith and reasonable interpretation of the court's order. The moving party, which would be the plaintiff in this case, Don't Shoot PDX and the protesters, the moving party bears the burden of showing that the alleged contemnor violated the court's order by clear and convincing evidence, not merely a preponderance of evidence. Which is, it's legal speak for it's a higher standard that they have to prove. You have to make a very strong case to get a contempt motion like this to go through. Thus, to succeed on a motion for civil contempt, the movement must show that the alleged contemptor violated the court order beyond substantial compliance and not based on a good faith and reasonable interpretation of the order by the clear and convincing evidence. Substantial compliance with the court order is a defense to civil contempt and is not vitiated by a few technical violations where every reasonable effort has been made to comply. Basically, if the police made some simple mistakes that put them out of compliance, that's not enough to get a contempt. The plaintiffs seek a finding of civil contempt and remedial sanctions against defendant, arguing that defendant's officers violated the order no fewer than 9 times on June 30th. In response, defendant argues each of the identified uses of force complied with the order and the police's use of force directive. In the alternative, defendant argues that it made every reasonable effort to comply with the order. Because plaintiffs have demonstrated by clear and convincing evidence that Portland police officers violated the order 3 times on June 30th, and defendant has not demonstrated that it took all reasonable steps to ensure its officers' compliance, the court finds the defendant, City of Portland, in contempt. So basically, the protesters came forward and said, we see 9 times where the cops violated the restraining order. The city was able to successfully argue 6 of them. And there were 3 that the judge still said, no, you violated grossly. So at the evidentiary hearing, plaintiffs argued that defendants' officers violated the order in their use of less lethal munitions no fewer than 9 times on the evening of June 30th. And in their briefing, the parties disputed whether defendants could be held liable for the actions of state police officers. The court doesn't need to resolve the issue because in closing argument, the defendant, the city, said that all the incidents in question involved the use of force by Portland police officers. 8 of these incidences involved the use of impact munitions, including FN 303s and 40mm launchers. 1 incident involved the use of OC spray and aerosol restraint. The order limits the Portland Police's use of these munitions as follows. The first one, FN 303s and 40mm less lethal launchers with or without OC pepper spray payload are limited to use as outlined in the Portland Police Use of Force Directive 1010, and in addition shall not be used where people engaged in passive resistance are likely to be subjected to force. And then the second part, aerosol restraints, handheld OC or pepper spray, shall not be used against persons engaged in passive resistance, and consistent with Portland Police Use of Force Directive 1010, members shall minimize exposure to non-targeted persons. Basically, this is reinforcing the idea of you have to only use these devices against people that you know are being aggressive towards you. If they're not being aggressive, you don't shoot them. Court addresses each type of munition in turn. As described above, FN 303s and 40mm less lethal launchers must be used as outlined in Use of Force Directive 1010 and shall not be used where people engaged in passive resistance are likely to be subject to use of force. Then the Use of Force Directive itself then provides in relative part that officers are authorized to use impact munitions in response to active aggression and to avoid the use of a higher level of force. As far as I know, the higher level of force would be live ammo. The directive defines active aggression as a threat or overt act of an assault through physical or verbal means, coupled with the present ability to carry out the threat or assault, which reasonably indicates that an assault or injury to any person is about to happen unless intervention occurs. The court finds that 3 of the 8 instances involved the use of impact munitions violated the order. These 3 instances included 2 deployments of 15 rounds from an FN 303 against individuals carrying a banner, the deployment of a few rounds from an FN 303 against an individual picking up an unknown object between the protest line and the police line. The remaining instances did not violate the order. Turning first to incident 2, which was the 2 people with the banner, the court finds that Officer Taylor did not use his FN 303 in response to active aggression. Officer Taylor testified that he had deployed his FN 303 against an individual holding on to a banner because he believed the banner would later be used as a weapon. Specifically, he cited the following circumstances in support of his belief that the banner may be dangerous: the atmosphere of the protest that day, the movement of protesters behind the sign as though it was a shield, and the slow pace of the protesters holding the banner causing interference with the police formations, and the protesters' refusal to let go of the banner, and the use of PVC pipe as the banner's frame, which he testified can be reinforced with cement or nails. But none of the circumstances cited by Officer Taylor suggested that this banner would be used imminently, was a weapon or would be used imminently by protesters as a weapon. Police officers had ample time to observe the banner before Officer Taylor deployed his munitions. The incident occurred while it was still light out, and video shows that the long PVC banner was flimsy. Further, in the moments before Officer Taylor fired his FN 303, the protesters carrying the banner were complying with Portland Police directions and moving with the rest of the crowd away from the Portland Police Association building. And, most importantly, nothing suggested that the individual Officer Taylor targeted was engaged in a threat or overt act of an assault, which reasonably indicated that an assault or injury of any person was about to happen unless intervention occurred. Basically, Brett Taylor shot too early. At most, the record shows that the individual who was refusing to let go of their sign was engaged in passive resistance. Because more is required for the use of impact munitions, the court finds that Officer Taylor's use of force did not comply with the Use of Force Directive 1010 and therefore violated the order. As to Incident 3, The court also finds that Officer Taylor's deployment of 10 rounds from his FN-303 against protesters trying to pull an individual on roller skates back into the crowd violated the order. Officer Taylor testified that he deployed his FN-303 in order to stop an unarrest and prevent an assault or the use of a higher level of force. He believed that officers were arresting the individual on roller skates because officers had their hands on this individual. He also believed that other protesters were attempting to unarrest the individual by pulling them back into the crowd, a situation that is dangerous for both officers and arrestee. But video of this chaotic moment does not support Officer Taylor's testimony. In video from the protesters' vantage point, it is clear that no arrest is being made. During the struggle over the banner, the individual on roller skates falls to the ground, and protesters try to pull the fallen individual back into the crowd. In video from the officer's perspective, officers appear to grab and shove the individual. Aside from a few brief moments of physical contact, however, there is nothing to suggest that this individual was under arrest. At no point does an officer declare that the skater was under arrest. And in the moments before the scuffle began, the individual was complying with Portland Police orders to move to the east along with the rest of the crowd. None of the protesters are engaged in any physical or verbal acts that could constitute a threat or an overt act of assault. Though undoubtedly a chaotic and difficult moment for an officer in his position, the evidence shows that Officer Taylor did not deploy his FN-303 in response to active aggression or to prevent the use of a higher level of force. Thus, Officer Taylor's use of impact munitions during Incident 3 violated the order. This is 2 for 2 now, where Officer Taylor has violated the order. Similarly, an unknown officer's use of impact munitions against an individual approaching an item in the road, Incident 9, was not in response to an act of aggression. This one we don't know who it is. It could have been any of the 20 officers that were out there. It could have been Officer Brett Taylor. We don't know. Alright, the individual walked out from the crowd of protesters towards an unknown object between the crowd and police line. As they leaned down to grab the item, an officer deployed multiple rounds from an FN-303 at them. After reviewing this video, Officer Domka testified that the behavior of this individual, stepping out of the crowd towards the police line and reaching down to pick up an object from the pavement, may indicate that the protester is about to throw an object at an officer. But it cannot simply be that any attempt by an individual to pick up an item off the ground at a protest constitutes a threat of assault to officers or others. There was nothing in this moment to suggest that the protester was grabbing an item with the intent to throw it at the police. The individual moved slowly and was struck by a munition before they even had the object in their hands. Because this protester was not engaged in active aggression, the officer's use of impact munitions violated the order. As to the remaining 5 instances involving impact munitions, however, plaintiffs have not demonstrated the defendant's officers violated the order. The deployment of impact munitions against Mr. Anglada, Mr. Haas, and Mr. Greatwood all complied with the use of force directive. Mr. Anglada and Ms. Haas both kicked smoke canisters in the direction of police officers, and Mr. Greatwood moved forward quickly, bent down, and successfully picked up a smoke canister. At the time of each incident, these 3 individuals were just a few of many protesters who were kicking or throwing smoke canisters and other projectiles at the police line. I will point out that Mr. Greatwood was most likely there in his position as press, which should have provided him some additional protection legally, but where he's picking up a smoke canister right in the middle of all the action, there is wiggle room there. So, while Mr. Greatwood, Ms. Haas, and Mr. Anglada may not have subjectively intended to assault or threaten to assault officers that evening, kicking or throwing smoke canisters constitutes a threat or act of assault. As Officers Domka and Taylor both testified, smoke canisters are heavy, hot, and dangerous projectiles when thrown at officers. When kicked, smoke canisters can envelop officers in smoke, eliminating their line of sight and providing an opportunity for individuals to injure officers with projectiles. Thus, under these circumstances, officers reasonably perceived the actions of Mr. Anglada, Ms. Haas, and Mr. Greatwood as active aggression, and their use of impact munitions was appropriate under the order. Similarly, the deployment of munitions against an unknown individual who attempted to throw an item at police officers and another individual who attempted to light a dumpster on fire complied with the Portland Police's use of force directive. Throwing items at police and starting fires at a protest reasonably constitute an act or an act of overt assault and create a risk of injury to officers or others without intervention. Thus, in the moments that they deployed impact munitions, officers reasonably perceived that these individuals were engaged in active aggression. Aerosol restraints, including OC spray, are not to be used against persons engaged in passive resistance. In the order, passive resistance is defined as a person's non-cooperation with a member that does not include violence or other active conduct by an individual. Use of force directive also restricts police use of pepper spray to instances where a person engages in physical resistance or indicates the intent to engage in physical resistance. Physical resistance is a person's physical attempt to evade a member's control that does not rise to the level of active aggression. The unknown officer's use of OC spray against Mr. Klingman did not violate the order, because Mr. Klingman's testimony and video of the incident shows that an officer deployed spray against Mr. Klingman mere seconds after Mr. Klingman grabbed an officer's baton. Though this action may have been inadvertent and without any aggressive intent, there is no dispute that Mr. Klingman grabbed an officer's weapon during a physical altercation. As an officer reasonably could have interpreted Mr. Klingman's actions as more than passive resistance, the use of OC spray complied with the order. So that lays out, where the judge is seeing that this is where the police messed up, and this is where they didn't from a legal perspective. Now, at this point, defenses to contempt, we're looking at what mitigating factors could be. That there is no good faith defense to contempt. As noted above, however, substantial compliance with a court order is a defense to civil contempt and is not vitiated by a few technical violations where every reasonable effort has been made to comply. In other words, if a violating party has taken all reasonable steps to comply with the court order, technical or inadvertent violations of the order will not support a finding of civil contempt. In his briefing, defendant argues that even if there were a few technical violations of the order, defendant took all reasonable steps to comply. Specifically, defendant cites Captain Pastore's repeated efforts to remind all officers of the requirements of the injunctions, including his radio broadcast that evening reciting the limitations of the order. Defendant also emphasizes that plaintiff's motion only cites to a handful of instances over the 2 months since the order has been in place. That said, these are all instances that happened on this one night. First, defendant's violation of the court order on June 30th were not merely technical or inadvertent as defendant suggests. During incidences 2 and 3, which was the incidents dealing with the sign, Officer Taylor deployed 15 rounds from his FN-303 against a group of protesters carrying a large banner who were otherwise complying with police order to move away from the PPA building. When another officer fired his FN-303 at an individual during Incident 9, nothing objectively indicated that this individual presented a threat to police officers. None of the individuals targeted by police in these instances were engaged in active aggression, and the use of force did not reasonably prevent the use of a higher level of force. All 3 individuals appear to have been struck by police munitions. The court cannot conclude that these 3 violations over an hour-long period were merely technical. Second, defendant has failed to demonstrate that he took all reasonable steps to comply with the order. The court acknowledges that defendant took some steps to ensure compliance on June 30th. Captain Pastore, for example, read the requirements of the order over the radio after calling for attention from all officers involved in crowd control on the evening of June 30th. There is also evidence in the record that Captain Pastore directed all supervisors to ensure that all officers were informed of the requirements of the order. And the court is cognizant that the PPB has been stretched thin over the past few months, with the same RRT officers working endless hours in response to ongoing protests. It is also aware of the effect the pandemic has had on Portland Police's ability to conduct additional trainings. Nevertheless, the court cannot conclude that a single radio transmission and a discussion with RRT officers and supervisors on June 30th constitutes all reasonable steps defendant could have taken to ensure compliance with the order that evening. Accordingly, the court finds the defendant, City of Portland, in contempt. The court grants in part plaintiff's amended motion for order to show cause. The court finds defendant, City of Portland, in contempt of its June 26 stipulated, which means that both sides came together and agreed to this restraining order. It wasn't forced on them by a judge. This stipulated additional temporary restraining order. Remedies for the above described violations of the order will be determined separately. Party shall contact the courtroom deputy within 3 days of this order to set a date for a scheduling conference, which, since this order came out on Friday, we're probably looking at by Wednesday, they're going to have a scheduling conference set. It is so ordered. Judge Marco Hernandez, United States District Judge for the District of Oregon. So yeah, this is fairly big news, and we don't know what the ramifications are going to be against the city. But where 2 of the 3 instances of officers violating the restraining order were directly attributed to Officer Brett Taylor, as well as his repeated history that we've seen at other protests of him shooting in areas that I think would be questionable, as well as the tendency that he's had of slashing tires of vehicles, to disable vehicles that may not have needed to be disabled. It's going to be very interesting to see what the outcome of this. It could be something as simple as a fine from the city. It could be disciplinary action against Brett Taylor, or him being benched from RRT or Grenadier duties. There's a lot of options that it could be. We will have to see what comes forward from this. It may take a week or so until we hear more, but when we do, we will be checking in with this. In the meantime, I want to thank you for hanging out with me for the last almost an hour here. Again, definitely follow along with us over at raindrop.works. And if you want to support us financially, we do have Cash App, Venmo, are both available as Raindrop Works PDX. And in the meantime, just be safe. Stay at home if you can. Wear a mask if you can't. We still have this pandemic going on that we need to keep under control, or get back under control. Everybody have a good day.